All right, everybody, let's get started. Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. It's great to be with you again for another edition of our program. Today, like always, we've got the opportunity to meet some interesting people who are doing some really interesting work here in North Carolina around science, nature, conservation, education, and more. As always, I'm your host, Chris Smith. Well, not as always. Sometimes other people do this job too. But I'm here today to welcome you to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Welcome to the month of November as well. Happy November 1, everybody. We made it. We're rounding out. It's wild to think about it. We're getting close to the end of 2023. But I'm glad that you're here. We've got a great program for you. Actually, I'm very excited about today's program because elk, I feel like, are one of those mysterious creatures of North Carolina. Unless you spend a lot of time up in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, maybe, then, like if you're down here with me in Raleigh, then we hear about elk. We know that they're out there. Maybe you've heard stories about them. Maybe you've heard some of the history about them here in North Carolina. But even if you head up that way, you may or may not see one. I'd have to say I've been fortunate. I've seen some of these animals not up close, at a distance. As we've learned from other folks in wildlife here in North Carolina, you probably shouldn't get too close to most of the wildlife in most cases. We learned that a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about black bears, didn't we? But they're impressive animals. So having, I think, not ever talked about elk here on the Lunchtime Discovery Series, the folks over in the Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality who put this program together reached out to the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and they got the elk expert. Everybody, I want you to meet Justin McVey. He's a district wildlife biologist for NCWRC, and Justin joins me now. Hi, Justin.
Good afternoon.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
I'm excited to learn a little bit more about elk, only because I've only seen them in the wild a couple of times. And both times are pretty magical. They're pretty incredible animals.
They absolutely are. I mean, just from the sheer size to, hearing that bugle in the early morning, in the mist, it's something pretty spectacular and a welcome sight.
You mentioned the bugle. We were talking about this earlier. The most watched video on the museum's YouTube channel, number one most popular video with almost 2 million hits, is 20 seconds of an elk bugling. Does that sound about right to you?
It's pretty popular for sure, and pretty memorable as well.
Hey, yeah, absolutely. Everybody, you can go after this. You can go look it up and add your view to the list as well. Well, Justin, I'll turn the program over to you. Let you get
Okay.
started.
All right. So thanks for having me. Excited to be here. Just as a way of introduction, my role with the Wildlife Commission is the district wildlife biologist. So I cover the western 12 counties of North Carolina. My job has a lot of different facets, from providing technical guidance to folks. And that's essentially when people want wildlife on their property, I can go out and say, here's what you can do to make your property more inhabitable or more attractive to wildlife. Or when folks don't want wildlife on their property, and a lot of times that's bears, I can tell them, here's what you need to do or don't do to, prevent any kind of conflicts. I also monitor for wildlife diseases, and I'm always monitoring populations and changing regulations as needed to ensure the conservation of our wildlife resources. Because we have elk in District 9, which is the western 12 counties, I also get to be the elk biologist, which is why I'm here today. And so I'll go ahead and get started with that. And if I can get the right screen here. All right. And so we'll go ahead and get started with Bugle in the Mountains, the return of elk to North Carolina. So as a little history, elk were in eastern United States. However, in the late 1700s, they were extirpated from North Carolina due to overharvest as well as habitat loss. And so that was the eastern elk, or the subspecies Cervus elaphus canadensis, and that species is now considered extinct. So a little bit more about the basics of elk. Well, first of all, a male is called a bull and a female is called a cow. A male or a bull can weigh around 1,000 pounds, whereas a cow, when she's mature, 6 or 7 years old, can get upwards to around 700 pounds. So really, really large animals. Their diet does consist of mainly of grass. They are a grass obligate species. However, they do eat forbs and browse. They will eat acorns or apples, things of that nature. However, they're always going to be associated with those open areas like early successional habitats or pastures or even oak savannas. The rut is the breeding season for elk, and that happens late September to mid-October, and that's the time where it kind of gets exciting in the elk world. You get males that are forming their harems of females. They are actively defending those females and those harems. They want to be the one that's able to breed with all of the females. So you get a lot of bugling at that time and a lot of fighting. And we just kind of came out of that time period. As with most, or as with all cervids, they have antlers that they drop yearly. And, when they are a full mature bull, which is, again, probably going to be around 5 to 7 years old, those antlers could be about 40 pounds, and they drop those yearly and regrow them yearly. That's a pretty amazing feat in itself. So they're going to drop them generally around March, and then they start growing them pretty much right afterwards. They can live up to about 20 years. We do still have a few really old ones around, but most of the time, average lifespan is probably going to be somewhere more from like 7 to 12 years in the wild. Some other basics about elk, just the gestation period of 240 to 262 days. I mentioned that rut or that breeding period is late September, early October, which puts the birth and when calves drop right at the perfect time in May and June. There's lots of green vegetation, kind of lots of groceries on the ground for mom to eat while she's lactating and provide that nutrition for the calf, as well as when that calf is weaned, there's still enough food for it to kind of pack on some weight before the winter. So how do we get elk? Like we said, they were extirpated back in the late 1700s. So how do we have them now? Well, that started with the National Park Service. They did some research in the late 90s looking at habitat in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park and if it would be suitable for elk to form a reproducing population. They decided that it was, and decided that they were going to reintroduce elk into Cataloochee area of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which is about 100-acre pasture in Haywood County. So in 2001 and 2002, elk were released. Initially, there was 25 from land between the lakes, which is in Kentucky, and then 27 in a second release from Elk Island National Park in Canada. However, even those ones from land between the lakes of Kentucky originally came from Elk Island National Park in Canada. So they are all of the subspecies Cervus elaphus manitobensis, or the Manitoban elk. And just to kind of get our geography and what we're talking about, this is Western North Carolina. And you can see here the area outlined in red is our elk zone that encompasses parts of Haywood, Jackson, and Swain County. In that land, there's multiple land types and jurisdictions, from state-owned game lands, U.S. Forest Service. There's, of course, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, as well as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian tribal land. And then there's also, you can see there in white, private land that's there on the southern area. So during this experimental period, essentially from 2001 all the way to 2007, the National Park Service handled all the management on and off of the park. So if there was any kind of nuisance situation where an elk was getting into someone's garden or knocking down fences, anything like that, the Park Service handled that. In 2007, the park deemed that, hey, elk have been reintroduced, they can reproduce here in North Carolina, and so they kind of handed off jurisdiction to the respective parties. So any elk that are on tribal lands are under the jurisdiction of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, while anything that's on Great Smoky Mountain National Park or Blue Ridge Parkway is handled by the National Park Service. Everything else, whether it's public or private land, is handled by us, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And so that's kind of how we got into the elk game. And some of those elk are in places where we want them, and some of them have kind of become, as you see here, kind of suburbanites, and sometimes they get into a little bit of mischief. But through this reintroduction, agency partnerships have been really, really important. So when I started in 2012, we started this elk working group between the Wildlife Commission, Cherokee, and the National Park Service. And we kind of get together and we would just talk elk, talk shop. One of the things that we were really curious about was population estimates, but we also were looking at nuisance elk issues and kind of sharing tips and tricks on how to resolve those types of things. And then mortality was also another big issue. You know, when an elk dies, whether it's hit by a car or some other reason, it's not really that easy just to throw in the back of a truck. So we have specialized trucks, and we communicate with different agencies to make sure, oh, there's one on your property or there's one on ours, and we help each other out with that. So these agency partnerships, you can see here some pictures of, you know, me putting collars on Park Service land, having park staff come out on private land and assisting me, having Cherokee staff come out and assist me, as well as in that bottom picture, allowing me to come on to Cherokee tribal land when an elk was darted on private land, then walked over onto Cherokee. And so having those working relationships is really beneficial. You know, we recognize that these elk they don't recognize jurisdictions, so they're going to go across boundaries. So it's not a park elk or a Cherokee elk or a commission elk. They're constantly moving across those jurisdictional boundaries. So really important that we maintain those working relationships. So as I mentioned, one of the goals of that working group was just talking about population. So right now we have somewhere around 250 animals. I'll get more into that here in a little bit. And up until recently, the best way that we had of counting elk was a minimum count. It's really basic. It's not great. In Western states, they can jump in helicopters or fly in airplanes and fly over and get estimates. With our mature forests, that's just not really an option. So these minimum counts that we do are essentially where 2 days in the middle of November, commission staff, park staff, and Cherokee staff go out, we spread out, and we literally just count how many elk we see. And through that, plus just on the boots or on the ground kind of experience, we can get an estimate of how many there are. So for example, 2022, our minimum count was 127, but we knew there was some that we were missing, some subherds that weren't seen. It's really difficult to see these elk, especially when they get into those forested areas. As you can see in this picture, we do have an elk here. And so I'll go on to the next picture. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on your computer screen, but this was an example of an elk that was actually hit by a car, and it had a GPS collar with a VHF tracker on it. And so I knew exactly where it was. I parked my truck. This is a picture I took standing right beside my truck. I could smell the elk, but I could not see it for a long time. Finally, my eyes kind of clicked and I was able to see where this elk was. So you can see right there in the center under the arrow or the antler sticking up from that wood pile. So kind of hiding in plain sight, which is, again, why it makes those minimum counts so difficult. However, our trend was good. As you can see, over the years, it was going up and up and up, that total number. And so that was a really positive thing. Again, this last year, it was lower. We knew that was just the fact that we didn't see them. We knew they didn't disappear or die off. It's just they were behind locked gates. And because of the limitations of this minimum count, this led us to our recent research project with the University of Tennessee and Dr. Joe Clark and Jessica Bronstein, who is now Dr. Jessica Bronstein. It was a 5-year PhD project. So the research objectives for this project initially was, we wanted to know what that population density was. We wanted to know about abundance, or how many elk there were. Then we wanted also to know how the elk are doing. So looking at metrics like survival, recruitment, and growth were really important. And this project would afford us those answers. We're also interested in, if those vital rates were sufficient to support a huntable population. One of the goals of the Wildlife Commission is to have a sustainable huntable population. And is our population at a point right now with the right amount of growth and survival that we could support that? So that was the second objective. And the third objective was just developing a practical, reliable, and cost-effective approach for future elk monitoring, something that the commission could kind of do in-house later on to kind of keep tabs on how elk are doing. So the way we did this is through and when I say we, I'm really talking about, Dr. Clark and Dr. Braunstein. They did all the heavy lifting. The rest of the staff, we did light lifting. I'll explain that later, but I'll just say we for ease. So what we did was use a method called spatially explicit capture recapture. And to kind of break that down, at the base of that is a method called capture mark recapture. And so what this does is it uses a Lincoln-Peterson index. And if you think about that population of mice there in the top right corner, we go into that population and we capture a certain amount of animals. And this one, we captured 9 mice and we mark those animals. Then we throw them back into the population, which is represented at that bottom gray box. And then we resample out of that. We resample out of, and that's represented by that dotted line square. So when we resample, we have caught, as you can see, 6 animals, but only 2 of those are marked. And through all those numbers, we put that into our index and we can get a population size estimate. That's the base of spatially explicit capture recapture. You add the spatial part of that comes by adding location data, activity centers. So what that looks like on the ground is, we didn't actually capture individual elk. What we did was capture their feces. Wildlife biologists, we call it scat. It makes us feel smarter and better about our jobs. So we went out and we walked these transects in the elk range. So what you're seeing here are 400 transects randomly distributed throughout the elk zone. Some of them are 500 meters, some of them are 1,500 meters. And we would walk those and literally just pick up any scat that we found, mark, where that scat was located, GPS coordinates and so on. That scat was then analyzed for DNA through fecal DNA. And through that, we could put that into our modeling in order to get our density and our abundance. Basically, that's our capture recapture part, is whether we're catching elk's individual DNA once and then catching it again. That's kind of the capture recapture part. So what that gets us are 3 separate years of density and abundance. So those 3 separate years, 2020, 21, and 22, were the years that we actually walked all those transects and were able to get an estimate of how many elk are there. Then by just comparing those 2 years to one another, we can get those other metrics that I spoke about that are telling us how the population is doing. So getting the things like survival, growth rate, and recruitment. So first, let's just talk about the abundance, what that capture recapture stuff got us and how many elk there were. Our total abundance here, you can see our total is in pink at the top, and you see a female to male breakdown, and that's about normal. And generally in unhunted elk populations, you get about 30 bulls per 100 cows. We're somewhere around there. You can see there's some variation there, but that trend line does follow pretty well those minimum count trend lines that I showed you earlier, except for that last year. And again, that's just illustrating the importance of methods like spatially explicit capture recapture. So you're able to actually catch those animals that you wouldn't be able to see, but you can find the remnants afterwards. So this is all positive growth. This is good stuff. So this is how many elk we have. Now, what about those other metrics that we were really interested in? So things like growth. Now, growth is just the growth of the population from one year to the next. Anything above 1 is a positive growth, means that the population is increasing, and anything below 1 is it's decreasing. Our overall is 1.125. And so that's showing some positive population growth and kind of confirming what we've seen. However, it is a little bit slow. It is important to remember, though, that all these numbers are almost like an average over the entire elk zone. In North Carolina, although we have 250 elk, those elk aren't necessarily all commingling or breeding with one another. It kind of works out. We have these different subherds, these almost subpopulations. Some of these subherds will commingle with one another, and some of them won't. And so these numbers are just an average of all that together, because we know that some of our subherds are not growing well, and some of them are growing really, really well. So remember that as we talk about these results. The next metric that we're going to talk about is survival, the probability of an elk surviving from 1 year to the next. Female probability is what we found to be 89%, and that's pretty good. That's kind of what we see up and down the eastern, United States with elk. So that's a pretty good survival rate. You'll notice that the male survival rate is somewhat lower at 51%. We expected that to be a little bit higher, and that may just be an artifact of a low sample size. If you think about the population being at a ratio of 30 bulls to 100 cows, it makes sense that we're going to get less bulls in our sample. So hopefully with increased sampling, which we are planning on continuing, that we'll kind of get better estimates of that male survival, and hopefully it'll be a little bit closer to the female survival rate. There are other factors that could come into play. During the summer we do see some juvenile dispersal, short-term dispersal. They kind of young males will set out on their own and look for their own territory, and sometimes that's outside of the elk zone. Generally, when they find out there's no cows there, they come back, and so that may be a reason that we're seeing that low survival number. And the last and third final metric is recruitment, which is just the number of calves, in this case per female, successfully the adult population. We're at 0.44. That's okay, about average. So that's just saying it's going to take about 2 to 3 years to successfully produce a calf that becomes, part of the adult population. So 2 to 3 years to replace that cow. And again, that might be part of the reason that we're seeing that slow growth rate. There are other factors, such as road mortalities. We do have that fairly often. We do have depredation issues, which is if an elk is causing damage, a landowner has the right to shoot and kill that elk. We also have predation issues, specifically with bears, preying on newborn calves. And then we also have some disease issues. There's a disease or a parasite out here called brainworm, real common in cervids, especially down in the southeast. Deer get it all the time, doesn't affect them. However, when elk get that brainworm, it can really kind of pack a wallop, and survival rate is affected because of that. So, but we are seeing growth. We're seeing calves being born, and that's a great thing. As you'll recall from our research objectives, one of the things that we were interested in was hunting. And so a number of years ago, we did, a rule was passed, basically establishing an elk season. It was kind of establishing the framework. So when this was passed, a resolution was also passed by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commissioners that would delay issuing of any hunting permit until, it was time that there was a sustainability had been determined. We also, got the license changed, so we created a resident and non-resident elk license at this time. So, now we kind of know how many elk we have. We know how they're doing. We're starting to think about harvest and if that's applicable. So we're working with some different models to look at hunting projections. So we've got all the data, and we'll just increase keep increasing that data with our continued sampling efforts through the years, and see if we eventually will have some limited harvest from elk. We do other research as well. Habitat selection model, we've been working on that for years, and various different ways of going about that. We've also worked on home ranges, which really needs to be redone. This is a little bit of dated data. Our home range, the Wildlife Commission's home range for cows and bulls, was a little bit larger than what the National Park Service had seen initially. And that's really two reasons. One, we're using GPS collars versus VHF collars, so a lot more data. Two, the methods that we used were different, so kind of comparing apples to oranges there. But I wanted to just kind of show some of that research and some of the data that we can get, some of the neat things that we can get from having collars on animals. So you see here, this bull has a bright orange collar that we used in year one of our collaring study. But each one of these individual dots represents a location of an elk. These are not all the same elk. You see the ones that are around Cataloochee pointed there. Those are all the same elk. And these locations tell us a lot of things, not only home range, but then we can get habitat selection. It's also used in our spatially explicit capture recapture modeling. But this one's pretty neat. The one that's pointed there to Cataloochee, this was actually a female that we collared in Cataloochee on Park Service land. You can see if you follow those little dots kind of up to the northeast, she goes up right up to I-40, and she hangs out there for a couple of days and then comes back to Cataloochee. And then, this was in 2013, and I was watching, these collars really, really closely. And then all of a sudden, one day, she just made a beeline, and she went straight, followed that same little dotted line path, went right to I-40, and that exit is actually exit 7 Harmon Den, and and she went under the underpass and went over into the Harmon Den, and she brought about 10 to 12 elk with her. I actually went out that day, and I could see all the hoof prints going underneath the interstate. And that's really about the only movement that we've seen back and forth across I-40. It pretty much acts like a barrier. And if you've ever driven through the gorge, you'll realize why. It's pretty rocky, and there's the river's there and a lake. So we don't see a whole lot of movement. But she established that group back in 2013, and they're still, about that same size there in Harmon Den. So we've talked about the research project and how the elk are doing, and said, yeah, they're doing pretty well, and we're seeing growth. So, what are some of the issues that we need to overcome? Well, by and large, habitat is going to be an issue. If you've ever been to Western North Carolina, people come here for looking at, the leaf change. We have a lot of mature forest. And as I mentioned, elk are grass obligate species, so they need those open pastures, that early successional habitat, or oak savannas, things that are a little more open and providing kind of the groceries. And we are just lacking that in this area, especially on public lands. So to kind of help with that, one of the things that happened was by procuring silver game lands. Now, this is in Maggie Valley. This map is a little outdated. There's some more tracts that have been added. But this, being a state-owned game land, really afforded us the opportunity to kind of do a lot more management than we're allowed to do on, say, U.S. Forest Service land, because kind of we as the Wildlife Commission are making more of the decisions. Now, part of this tract was actually slated to be a ski resort. If you look over to the right-hand side of that map, you'll see those long linear lines. Well, those were the ski slopes. So through funding from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, we were able to go in and kind of reclaim those ski slopes, kind of knock the edges to make them not so straight and linear, and then really open up some areas in the area, on the game lands, to create that early successional habitat and those open pastures. We did things like daylighting roads. So that top left corner is where we went into a road. We knocked back the trees on either side to allow more sunlight to hit the ground. And with that, we can plan it And as you can see, the vegetation coming up. The bottom right-hand picture there is actually, if you look up kind of on the right of that, is actually one of the ski slopes coming down. So we kind of reclaimed some of these areas and made them more open areas, and the elk have responded really, really well. We're seeing it all throughout silver game lands, as well as on U.S. Forest Service lands where we've done some projects. We, you know, were really vocal during the Pisgah Forest Revision Plan. We really pushed to have early successional habitat. And to be honest, whether elk use it or not, it didn't really matter, because what's lacking in Western North Carolina is early successional habitat, and all sorts of wildlife critters use it, from bear to deer, turkey to golden winged warblers. It's just a really, really valuable habitat type that's missing here. So, I waved my elk flag, elk habitat flag, and we were able to make some gains on Forest Service lands, as some of these pictures show. The next issue to overcome is nuisance animals. So, whenever you reintroduce a 800-pound long-legged herbivore, you're going to have some issues. We have issues where people are feeding elk, trying to acclimate them, trying to pet them, as is shown in this left-hand picture there. We also have cases where elk are, just looking for food. In this particular case, it was some apple trees. And it wasn't just merely that it was apple trees. I mean, there's, these apple trees were planted by the man's late father, so there was an emotional connection to it. And so trying to mitigate those issues is a challenge. And to help with that, we started or launched our Elk Smart initiative. Now, Elk Smart is a program that was started by my colleague Jeremy Banfield in Pennsylvania a number of years ago, with the idea of, hey, let's keep North Carolina elk wild. And so we, jumped on the Elk Smart bandwagon, followed the same tenets that Pennsylvania uses of, give elk space, don't approach them, don't feed them, don't name them. We want them to be wild, and not seen as pets. And then do your part, making sure that if you see somebody doing something wrong, to let them know, to make sure that those elk are kept wild. This part of it was kind of really focused more for tourists, but we do have a component that was aimed more at our local folks. There are going to be some conflicts, as I mentioned, so we can advise things like fencing or scare devices, the use of repellents, or even non-lethal projectiles. And of course, we're always available to come out to and visit a landowner and just see what we can do to help out the best we can. And so that's the end. That's elk in North Carolina. And with that, I'll take any questions, if I can stop sharing my screen.
Awesome stuff. Justin, thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
Elk really are incredible animals. They're gorgeous. Having seen them up close, having not seen them up close for me, but you having seen them up close, just what is that like?
It's really amazing. I mean, I'm a really big guy. I'm 6'6", and to stand close, or when we have them down on the ground, to have that 800, 900-pound bull there is just an amazing feeling. And a lot of people say that they stink, but I like the way they stink. I don't know. It's just a pretty neat animal.
A lot different than being around like just white-tailed deer all the time, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Viewers, I'll remind you, if you've got questions, go ahead, type them up into the chat. Let me know. Get those questions rolling in. That way we can have a nice Q&A, because we got plenty of time here to chat about elk in North Carolina. But Justin, while viewers are sort of downloading their thoughts into the chat, I was curious and had a few questions for you. What do we know about early successional habitat in North Carolina, say, before the elk were extirpated here? Like, what did Western North Carolina look like that we would have had so many elk? Because I think mountains, And I think what you said, right, just all old growth forest, but it doesn't
Right.
sound like
Yeah,
that's what we had.
it wasn't. The landscape was totally different. We definitely have more forested areas than we did historically. And also the elk that were here before were a little bit smaller and a little more well adapted to having some, being woodland elk. But yeah, it was just a different landscape type for sure.
And I guess the elk would have done a lot to maintain a lot of that early habitat too if they were grazing all over the place.
And that's the idea, a lot of folks have, and people thought that would happen now is that when you have a density of elk, it would be enough to kind of keep it knocked back, that early successional level knocked back. And historically, that probably did happen because they had the numbers. We don't see that in North Carolina, most likely because we just don't have enough elk. We do have some balds around, but the numbers of elk just aren't there to keep those areas bald.
Got you. And that kind of leads into another question I had was how many elk do you want? I mean, not even considering like what gets you to a huntable population, but like what can the habitat in North Carolina sustain? Or do
So,
we know?
well, you have to think about, carrying capacities and biological carrying capacity versus a social carrying capacity. So even in the existing elk zone that we have now, we could support a lot more elk. A lot of them would be, the majority of them would be on private land, but there could be more elk. However, the folks that live here, some of them don't want to see any more elk. So there's a balance there. I don't think that the Wildlife Commission necessarily has a number as a goal. We would just like a sustainable, huntable population. And I think, numbers around 250, 300 reach that. We've done some modeling before that said our biological carrying capacity for the elk zone and the lands that we manage is actually pretty low. I think it was 350 to 400. So we're pretty close to that now.
Okay, fascinating. Really interesting. Um, and then I think the only another thing that I was curious about, and a whole bunch of questions has rolled in, so I'm going to get to theirs in just a moment. But I have to ask you about this. You showed us the map of all the transects that the team walked in order to do the elk counts, and some of those transects look like they went straight up through the mountains. So I have to ask what that must have been like to look at a map and go, okay, what transect are we doing? And then just like looking up into what I could imagine was just a jungle.
Right. And that's part of the hard work of science. We knew from the get-go we weren't going to find elk sign, on the side of a cliff going up through some rhododendron and mountain laurel thickets. However, one of the initial goals, one of the things that we needed to find out is were there elk that we didn't know about? And that project really helped us figure that out and made us more confident that, yeah, we have a pretty good idea. Elk are going to be focused around those open areas. So while the walking was tough, at the same time, you're walking through the woods by yourself, just in nature, even if it's hard, and thinking, man, I get paid for this. And so, I can't really complain too much.
Yeah, I guess not. Did you get surprised at all on any of those walks?
I did. There were a few areas. So, bulls in particular will form what we call satellite groups, and they'll form after the rut. You'll have a few bulls that kind of link up together and they hang out for the rest of the year, except for the rut. And there were a few places that I didn't expect to see those satellite bull groups. But that was a handful, but still it was pretty neat and exciting. Or when you walk somewhere where you weren't expecting to see an elk and you come around the corner and you see, a bull on the ridge looking down at you. That's always exciting.
Oh yeah. That would be so cool. All right. Well, thanks for answering my questions. Let me get some from our viewers for you. Um, Michael wants to know if you think the elk will establish long term.
I think so. I mean, they've been here for 20 years. The population has been increasing. There is still capacity for them to expand. Our elk zone when I showed you that map earlier with the red outline, that wasn't created by the Wildlife Commission or anyone. It was just where the elk are and where they want to go. So there are areas that the elk could go where there's still a lot more habitat. So I definitely think there is some possibility for expansion. I think one of the key issues is going to be social support for expansion of that elk herd.
Right. Yeah. And there's a couple of questions along those same lines. Like Troy was curious about concerns on overgrazing, like along stream banks.
Yeah, you see that out west. You hear about the aspens and things like that, and we just don't see that a lot here. I think our population, really our densities are pretty low compared to other places, and so we're not really seeing that. One of the examples that I have for that is, in 2012, I had a sub herd that was using a recently clear cut piece of forest, and so had been clear cut 3 or 4 years ago, so it was real brushy and thick, but it was providing just a lot of vegetations that the elk really liked. And at the time, there was quite a few elk in that small little area. However, there weren't enough numbers, even with 30, 40 elk on a couple acre spot. That now is, poplars and maples, so it grew up and wasn't held back.
Oh wow, yeah. I was thinking that too during the presentation, and we chatted just now, right? Like, do they keep a meadow as a meadow? But it sounds like you need a lot of elk working 24 hours a day to really keep it down.
Right.
Uh, let's see here. In terms of expanding range, I mean, there's a lot of meadows if you start to move east out of the mountains. Do you think that elk would head east into North Carolina?
So right now, I think the most probable place for them to expand is really up towards Madison County. So if you remember that map that I showed you and that story about the cow moving to Harmondin and taking that little group, she crossed I-40, which is a big barrier. And if she just kept on going a little bit further, north and east, there are a lot more, open areas. However, they are all private lands and beautiful horse pastures and cow pastures. So I'm not sure the folks would like it, but there is the habitat there. As far as really expanding eastward anywhere else, I don't foresee that happening. It's just you start getting too many roads and too many people in other parts of the state as you go east.
Okay, yeah, just the people get in the way. Next question for you that I got here. Uh, Glenn says, I assume elk wasting disease has not been found in North Carolina.
So I'm assuming he's talking about chronic wasting disease, which is
Okay.
a neurological disease that is always fatal in cervids. And chronic wasting disease has been found in North Carolina, but only in white-tailed deer. So right now, the area around Surrey County and now out towards Johnston and Cumberland County, we've had some CWD positive deer. However, that fatal disease has not been found in elk. Any elk that dies that we can get our hands on, we do test for, and we have not found it yet.
Well, that's good news. That's good news. Has there been any evidence of poaching?
Yes. So, I mean, you're going to have a little bit of that. I believe about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a person that was found guilty of poaching and faced all the repercussions. So it does happen from time to time.
Let's see here. Okay, more for you. So Jane wanted to know about the historical range in North Carolina. You showed us that map from that included the range in the 1780s, which I guess historical records had them across what, about half of the state?
Yeah. So
Is that
the
about right?
historical records are you have some from Bantram and his travels and his journaling of where he saw elk, and then you also have a lot of place names where people think, oh, they must have had elk there. For example, Banner Elk. that suggest that there at one time were elk there. So yeah, they were definitely further east than where they are now. But again, it was also a different landscape type then.
Right. Yeah, sure. All right, next one for you. Jerry wants to know, can an area such as Dalton Park and the Bluff Meadows support elk?
I'm not familiar with those places.
Uh, North of the Blue Ridge Parkway. So I guess northern western.
Yeah, I mean, so anywhere that I mean, if you think about just having a pasture,
Mhm.
is that really open land or that early successional habitat, that stuff that looks like, knee or chest high, just really thick, scrubby stuff that you don't want to walk through. The picture behind me, if you think about, if you have places like this, that's where elk could be supported. However, there's lots of other factors involved. Distance to roads, different distance to crops, airports. You have to factor in people with that. We actually did some habitat modeling back in 2013 and looked at North Carolina and which place would be the most appropriate to have elk. And actually, interestingly, the place that kind of popped out as being the best was Caswell County. However, if you think about, if you're from North Carolina, know Caswell County, that's farmlands, that's open fields, and so that's why, and it's pretty rural, and so that's why that area really popped open, as a suitable place. But the commission doesn't have any plans to move elk. We're going to let them be where they are and expand naturally.
Yeah, it seems like you'd have to get a lot more elk on the current landscape where they're at before you could even begin to, even before they would sort of naturally maybe disperse to other good habitat areas, even just in North Carolina, right?
Exactly, and there has been some interest from various groups about moving elk from our existing elk zone to other places, but that's the same thing as harvesting elk, and we're really really conservative and cautious with those numbers, and we'd like to just let them be where they are and go from there.
Yeah. Another viewer wants to know if processing the DNA is really an efficient process or if it's just really time consuming. It sounds like it's a great way to do the counting, uh, but what really goes into it?
Well, it's definitely time consuming. I mean, not on field staff. Basically all I'm doing is going out with a Ziploc bag and bagging and tagging and sending it off. But yeah, so each one of those samples has to be, scraped with a toothpick and then put into a medium, and then all those samples shipped off to a lab. Previously we used a lab in Canada. When our future sampling will actually be using Dr. Heather Evans, who works at the museum and for North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. So, I mean, she's going to be doing that in-house. So that kind of leads me to say it's time consuming, but not undoable. I think she'll be able to turn it around. And we're not talking about a million samples either. We're talking about maybe 100 samples a year, maybe 200. And, with the automation and all that, it should be not too bad.
Oh, that's
Dr.
awesome.
Dr. Evans might say something different, but that's my.
Right. Yeah, I see Dr. Evans all the time here in the museum because Heather works closely with the genomics lab
Yep.
that's a part of the museum and part of North Carolina Central University to run samples and do DNA analysis just right here. That's cool. I wonder, oh my gosh, I got to find out if elk samples are coming to Raleigh
They
and going
are.
to be in the lab,
They
in
will be.
our lab. Oh, I'm
So
going to get a picture of an elk poop.
we'll be sending those probably around February of 2024. So be on the lookout. I'll CC you on the address label.
I, just I want to get a note. Chris, the poop samples are here if you wanted to come check it out. Watch the DNA get run. All right, let's see here. Troy wants to know if the Park Service, National Park Service, has any plans for Cades Cove and elk.
No, I think when the Park Service originally did their habitat analysis, looking at elk feasibility, two spots popped up, number one and number two. Cades Cove was the best choice to have elk, and Cataloochee was the second choice. However, the parks, and I'm speaking on their behalf from documents that I've read, um, but based on the fact that Cades Cove already had such a big tourist component, there were so many people already there, they didn't want to add anything else. You've probably all heard of the bear jams that they have in Cades Cove that just causes nightmares when people see a bear and everybody stops their cars. So they didn't want to add any additional pressure. So I don't believe that they're going to want to move any elk there. And now at this point, especially with chronic wasting disease being, so close to us, the fastest way to move a disease is by, putting it on a truck and moving it somewhere. So I don't believe they're going to want to do that.
Yeah, right. I mean, I've seen elk at the Econolofty Visitor Center close to Cherokee, and I've been in an elk jam and seen people veering off from the road as quickly as they can to try to see them, and people just slowing down. And yeah, it becomes a mess, probably times 5 or times 10 in a place like Cades Cove.
And biologically, we talked about bear predation being a pretty big thing for elk survival, and Cades Cove is loaded with bears. So the survival of the elk there, even without tourist types of issues, would probably be pretty low.
That did surprise me. You said predation, and I thought, what's hunting and killing elk in the mountains? And then you said black bear, and I was like, elk are as big, as heavy as our biggest black bears, but you said it's the young that they go for.
Yeah, so when a calf is born, it's 30, 40 pounds. It's just like a deer where it's kind of a hider species, and mom will, set that calf down, and the calf is just supposed to sit there and not move. And bears can smell it, they find them, and part of nature.
The meal. Yeah, there's a meal. It reminds me of a study that Roland Kays did here at the museum with inflatable white-tailed deer fawns, like these little inflatable models, and they put them out and set up camera traps. And I think they saw deer investigating the white-tailed deer fawns too for the same reason, actually. I have to go check it. I'll have to go find Roland and ask him about that. So just a couple other questions here. I'm curious how you feel about the elk populations, because like Wildlife Resources Commission is always out there in the community. They're talking to the neighbors, they're talking to landowners, they're talking to government agencies and non-government agencies. So are most people that you talk to and work with on board with elk growth in North Carolina?
Most people
to me, it seems like a great thing. I love it when people get to see charismatic animals on the landscape. But there's a lot of different groups and a lot of different people, and opinions must be all across a huge spectrum.
They are, and we've actually done some surveys over the years. We did one, back in I think 2014 or 2015, looking at folks, their opinions and attitudes towards elk. And what we found was that if they were a large landowner that lived in an area that has had elk or had elk damage, well, they were less likely to like elk, and that makes sense. And if they were, away from that, actually having elk on their property, they were more tolerant or more acceptable. We repeated that survey last year, and overall, the attitude was positive. So, there are still going to be some folks that don't like elk, but overall, there was still support across the board for elk.
And are there any other metrics that you want to use, or you think you should be using, or not should use, but are investigating to try to better understand the population dynamics, to keep saying that the elk reintroduction effort in the last 20 plus years is successful?
Well, I really think, with this capture recapture stuff, yes, we're using the genetics just to get those population numbers and those growth rates and survival, but that data can be used for a lot of other stuff, looking at heredity and inbreeding and all these different things, family lineages. So there's a lot of opportunity from the data we've already collected. We've already had the stuff in hand, that everything's already been analyzed, and we're going to continue to do that. I think that one tool is going to be a really, really big tool in the future.
That's exciting. So there's a lot more science that can be done with the tools that you've got right now.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, we've already got this great tool of DNA, and there's lots of other questions that can be answered using the stuff that we've already collected and already analyzed.
Well, that's exciting stuff. I like it when we end on a frontier.
Yes, sir.
We're at the edge of discovery, even after 23 years of elk reintroduction.
And and just behavior is, we see changes in behavior, and that's always kind of neat to see. I mean, I tell folks all the time, when I first started back in 2012 and we were trying to collar elk, I mean, I was dressed in a ghillie suit up at 4 a.m. in a tree stand. It was just really, really hardcore stuff. And now in some groups, I can just roll the truck window down and dart. So, there's lots of changes and things to come.
Exciting stuff. Well, Justin, thanks for being on the Lunchtime Discovery Series today. Really appreciate your time.
Sure, absolutely.
And there's people in the chat. Sarah's headed to Cherokee soon, so they're going to go look for some elk while they're there.
Lefty is a great place to start.
Excellent stuff. Well, this was fun, everybody. Hope you learned something new, something interesting. We'll be back here again next week with another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series. We're going to be talking about nature in your backyard with author Sarah Gagne. So I hope I pronounced her name right. But don't miss out. It's going to be a great conversation. Next week, there will be a guest host as well, so I won't see you. But you're going to be in good hands with Aaron Apple from the museum. Until then, everybody, make sure that you are following the Museum of Natural Sciences on social media. We're at Natural Sciences on all the platforms. You can also follow the Office of Environmental Education. They're at North Carolina EE. And if you want updates about this program and so many others, head to eenorthcarolina.org. That's the website for the Office of Environmental Education. There you can sign up for the email newsletter for this program and see all the other stuff that they've got going on. And of course, naturalsciences.org is where you can find us. And I think if you want to learn more about elk, you can head to NC Wildlife on social media and online and find facts, reports, papers, probably lots of pictures of elk as well if you just want to browse around and learn more and maybe find ways to get involved. So everybody, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you again next time. Have a great week, everybody. Bye.